The First War for Scottish Independence was an incredibly important time for the country. The land and its people were fighting for many reasons, but chief among them were the right to an independent state and the removal of the oppressive English regime. The initial rebellion was very much linked to two great Scottish warriors, William Wallace and Andrew de Moray, who would raise forces against the English invaders and initiate an 8-year war. Eventually, in 1305, Wallace would be caught and brutally executed for his part in the uprising, with Moray dying some years earlier at the Battle of Stirling brig. With these men no longer leading the charge, the English king believed that Scotland was finally conquered. In 1304, John Comyn, known as the Red Comyn, a claimant to the Scottish throne, negotiated the general submission of Scotland to the English forces, an idea chiefly backed by the Scottish nobles, yet abhorred by its people. It was only then that a figure who had existed in the political background of the war stepped forward into the light, Robert the Bruce. Robert was a well-known Scottish nobleman and had a legitimate claim to the Scottish throne, and it was perhaps due to this that he remained in good terms with the English king, and even attended Edward's court in London. The English king believed that Robert's title and lineage could be used to control the Scottish rebels, or at very least gain the favour of the Scottish nobility, which for a long time it did. But when hearing of the Red Comyn's betrayal of the Scottish people, Bruce rode north to meet his relative. The two surviving claimants of the Scottish throne met in Greyfriars Church in Dumfries on the 10th of February 1306. No one quite knows what was said within those hallowed walls, but only one man would return from the meeting, a man that would soon be crowned King of Scots. Once more, the fires of rebellion were ignited, with Robert the Bruce as the new Scottish king, pledging to free his land from the English invasion. The Bruce and the Spider. Enraged by the death of the Red Comyn, Edward I of England named the then Earl of Pembroke, Emir de Valence, as a special lieutenant for Scotland, and sent him to destroy Bruce's rebellion. Now Valence was joined by the English nobles Sir Henry Percy and Sir Robert Clifford, along with an army of 3,000 soldiers. With this invading force, Edward I gave the order that no mercy was to be given, and all captured or surrendered Scotsmen were to be executed without trial. The English host marched north and settled in the city of Perth, but no sooner had it done this than the army of Bruce appeared upon the doorstep. King Robert, in the classic chivalric tradition of a knight, approached the gate and called upon de Valence to come forth and battle. But the English Earl was far from an honourable man. He refused to fight the Bruce due to the day's late hour, and claimed he could only prepare himself to battle the following morning. The Scottish king left Perth and rested his men some miles away by the River Almond, where he would prepare for his morning duel. But that night, the army of de Valence fell upon the Scots in a surprise attack. Robert's forces were heavily outnumbered and taken unaware. They had no way of winning what would one day be known as the Battle of Methven. During the madness, it was said that the Bruce himself unhorsed de Valence before he himself was unhorsed by Sir Philip Mowbray, a Scottish noble who had joined the English cause. The demonic terror that was the Black Douglas is said to have cut a path to his dear friend, the Scottish king, and saved him from capture. It was then that Bruce and the Douglas, along with a small retinue of Scottish knights, formed a phalanx and broke free of the English army, forced to flee in a shattering defeat. That day, many of those most loyal to the Bruce and his cause would die on the battlefield or would soon be executed by the English. During this rout, Bruce would send his wife, daughters, and a party of other noblewomen to the castle of Kildrummie to be protected by his brother, Neil Bruce. Then Robert and a handful of his closest friends and supporters would flee the open battlegrounds of Scotland and go into hiding. Unfortunately for the king, later in that same year, an English host would fall upon Kildrummie, taking the castle and executing Robert's brother and any other that claimed to follow the Bruce. The women within the castle were taken prisoner and shipped to London. So with all that, Robert the Bruce had lost his crown, his country, his army, his family, his home, and his beloved. Truly he had reached rock bottom. Now no one truly knows where Robert the Bruce hid while he was fleeing the English soldiers, and this is the point in our tale where we leave the history books and enter one of the most important and famous passages of Scottish lore. Just off the northeast coast of Ireland sits the small island of Rathlin, a very quiet place, far from the chaotic battles and great cities of the mainland, and it was here where Robert the Bruce was thought to have passed the cold winter months of 1306. He was to be granted the use of Rathlin Castle. Its owners, the Bissett family, were kin of Angus Og MacDonald, a close friend of the Bruce, and the very man who is said to have ferried the king and his retinue to the island. Rathlin was not the lavish and grandiose affair that Bruce had grown accustomed to. It was a small and cramped space, where the chill winter wind rattled through worn and weary doors. Deep within the damp halls of the castle, King Robert lay alone upon a bed of straw near a low-burning peat fire. But still wrapped about him was a thick travelling cloak, for warmth was never a great attribute of this castle. Now he truly was the outlaw king. Everything he once had, and everything he had battled so hard to protect and defend, had ultimately been lost. In his deep despair, the man wondered if the freedom of Scotland could possibly be worth the price that he had already paid. Was it worth the mindless slaughter of many a brave warrior, the misery of their wives and children, not to mention the men that he himself had slain, and not all in the heat of battle? One for certain, his kinsman, John Comyn, was killed in cold blood. Robert thought that perhaps his story here had come to an end, that he and his remaining friends should leave their homeland and go instead to the Holy Lands in the east. There they could join many other brave knights, and in the battle for that land perhaps atone for their many sins. Yet how could he abandon Scotland after all that had been sacrificed by its people, a people who he claimed to lead? The cold wind howled louder, and the fire burned low, yet Robert sat motionless, enraptured by his disturbing and troubled thoughts. It was only when a flicker of movement appeared in the corner of his eye that the man was suddenly returned from his dissociative state. There, hanging from a long, invisible thread, was a spider. The little creature was attached to one of the wooden beams on the ceiling, and was attempting to swing itself by use of a silken thread to the next beam along. But each time the spider tried, it would fail. Again and again it tried, but all to no avail. 6 times, the king would watch the spider try to reach the next wooden beam, and fail. 6 times, thought Robert. 6 times I have fought the English, and failed. The king focused intently on the little creature as it climbed back up the thread and made another attempt. This time the spider made it. He latched on to the second beam, and quickly fastened his silk thread there, creating the first strand of a great web that the spider would one day weave. Robert the Bruce sat up and smiled. The spider never gave up, he thought, and neither shall I. Scotland shall be free. Returning to the history books, Bruce and his followers would appear in the Scottish mainland in February of 1307, with no one knowing where the outlaw king had spent the winter. Men from all over Scotland rallied to the Bruce. Soon he won the Battle of Glentrool, before meeting de Valence again at the Battle of Loudon Hill, where Bruce won his first major victory against the English, wiping out all 3,000 of de Valence's army. At the same time, the Black Douglas travelled southeast and rallied more men to the call of the Bruce, sacking many English castles and forts as he went. Eventually, this would all end in the Great Battle of Bannockburn, where an army of some 7,000, made up of Scotsmen, Gallaglass warriors, and men from the Isles, led by the Bruce, would face an English force of over 25,000 men, over 4 times their size. The Scottish forces, through strategic military planning and their legendarily fierce fighting style, would shatter the English forces, killing over half of their infantry and cavalry, while only taking around 100 casualties, winning them perhaps the greatest battle that Scotland has ever seen. With the English massacred in open field, and their remaining forces in full rout, King of Scots, Robert the Bruce, declared Scotland as a free and independent country, the scourge of English oppression wiped from our lands, and all of this because of one little spider. Thank you for listening, and a special thank you to my wonderful patrons for helping me keep these tales alive. This enchanting tale of perseverance is perhaps one of the most famous in Scotland. I can vividly remember reading this tale as a young child. It was in a picture book with little words, but would teach me the worth of determination and the importance of freedom. The fact that this tale made its way to a children's book, I think, shows you just how important it is to the Scottish people. And although it is entirely allegorical, the story of Bruce and the spider is a part of Scottish identity. Let no man say that the Scots are not determined, a fact you will most likely know yourself, if you've ever had the misfortune to argue with one of us. So important was the story that it was believed at one point in Scottish history that a man with the name of Bruce should never kill a spider, as it would bring upon him the most terrible of luck and dishonour his namesake. How common this was, I cannot say, but it is recorded as a notable Scottish superstition. Like all of these famous folk tales of legend, Bruce and the Spider also has many variations and versions. The most common of these is the spider in King's Cave. This version tells that Bruce spent the winter on the Isle of Arran, sheltering in a cave. It was here that Bruce would see the spider and gain the inspiration to continue his fight. This cave, now known as the King's Cave, lays hidden on the western side of the island, and in many ways it could have been a great hiding place if only the Bruce had enough food and warmth aplenty. In another common version of the story, Bruce retreats to an unnamed island off the west coast of Scotland and takes refuge in an abandoned hut. It is there in the deteriorating wooden structure that he happens upon a spider trying to weave a web between the rafters. The version that I have told is thought to have been the most historically plausible. As it is told, the Bissett family, owners of Rathlin Castle, were said to have lost the castle to the English much later, as penance for hiding the Bruce. But quite honestly, I couldn't find any substantial historical evidence to back this up. We know that Rathlin Castle would exit the ownership of the Bissett family, but there is no reason given, and it might not be necessary to tie it to the story. Unfortunately, this tale is thought to be mostly or entirely fictitious, but I think it does poetically capture the return and determination of Robert the Bruce, and perhaps in a more digestible or child-friendly way. This aligns perfectly with its first notable mention, coming from Sir Walter Scott's Tales of a Grandfather, released in 1827, a brief view of Scottish history, told through folklore and legends, and addressed to his 6-year-old grandson. So the legend of Bruce and the Spider was a creation of Sir Walter Scott, but this was by no means the beginning of the story. Scott himself claimed inspiration from an older tale found in The History of the House of Douglas by David Hume of Godscroft, which was published in 1647. In this version, it is none other than the Black Douglas himself who spots the spider, and upon seeing the creature succeed in its web building after a dozen or so failed attempts, he runs to King Robert and rallies his friend's spirits with this tale of determination. So far I can find no version of this tale which predates that of David Hume, but it is believed to have existed before then, as an oral story handed down through generations of Scottish storytellers. But how far back that history extends, and if it ever reaches a contemporaneous time with Robert the Bruce, we just don't know. But there are many other legends from around the world that involve a king and a spider, like that of the Jewish King David, or the Polish King Władysław the Elbow High. But only one, in my opinion, truly captures the essence and the moral of the Bruce story, and that is Timur and the Ant. Timur was a 14th century Mongolian warlord, determined to rebuild the great Mongolian Empire. And much like our King Robert, Timur found himself in great despair. His political dealings had fallen apart, and he had lost a recent battle, dwindling what would one day be an immense conquering army to just a few loyal tribesmen. Upon losing everything, Timur went into hiding. He would shelter in some old ruins, and while contemplating his recent loss, the man would see an ant crawling upon the ground. This ant was carrying a grain of rice, more than double its size, and trying to climb up the steep slope of a ruined wall. Each time the ant attempted to push his cargo up the slope, it would lose footing and tumble back down to the bottom. Again and again, the ant failed its task, until on the 20th attempt, the little ant succeeded and quickly carried its prize off to its nest. The man thought to himself, if an ant can persevere like this, then surely a man can do the same, let alone a man as powerful as the great Timur. With his spirit renewed, Timur would once again gather an army, and soon go on to conquer Central Asia, creating his very own empire. To this very day, we still have no real idea where the great Scottish king spent the winter of 1306. Some believe that he was given refuge by Christina of the Isles, a Scottish noblewoman who had supported Robert's claim to the throne. Orkney or the long trip to Norway were also considered possibilities. Orkney at the time was under Norwegian rule, and Robert's sister, Isabel Bruce, was the Norwegian queen consort, meaning that he would be safe within her lands. But many historical scholars agree that the most probable hideout for Bruce was on one of the many western islands of Scotland. We cannot be sure what Robert found upon those islands, and how he regained the strength and fortitude to continue the war for independence. But I, for one, will be forever grateful that the king returned and finished his battle, cementing the want and need of all future Scotsmen to be free. Slán